So welcome to the LifeBulb seminar series focused on organ transplantation. My name is Karin Heemberger. I'm the president of LifeBulb. I'm here in the role of a transplant recipient, but also as someone who's trained as a physician and scientist for many, many years. I'm really privileged to be here today together with Professor Ken Newell and from Emory, and I'm going to let Dr. Newell introduce himself and share some thoughts about the status quo right now for patients who are living with an organ transplant and some of the opportunities that we can see going forward that are already today tangible. So they're not just things that can happen in the next 10 to 20 years, but these are steps that we can take to improve our quality of life right now. Newell, and let's hear a little bit about your background and what you've been doing in the field, which is really impressive.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. So my name's Ken Newell. I'm a transplant surgeon at Emory in Atlanta. I've been there now 23 years, I guess. And my career is that of a transplant surgeon, but also a scientist. I've had a lab that's studied basic mechanisms of immune injury and ways to try to prevent that, and studied approaches to trying to induce tolerance to transplanted organs. I've also been very involved in large-scale clinical trials sponsored by pharmaceutical companies or the NIH or the Immune Tolerance Network. So I'm happy to be here and share some thoughts with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Someone who's living with a kidney and a pancreas, and for me, it's my second kidney transplant that I received. I'm on certain drugs that have been approved and available to transplant patients for a very long time. We're very, very grateful to the surgeons, the scientists who develop these drugs because they keep the organs alive for a certain period of time. They do cause some side effects. And I think importantly, there is a limit to how long that our organs can last in the recipient, very much due to the drugs, not just to avoid rejection, but the very drugs that we're taking have an effect on the function of the organ. Can you elaborate a little bit about that and talk about what are the kind of different regimens that we are using right now in the most common kidney transplant recipients?
Sure. I would start by saying that transplant, when I started, was perhaps one of the most innovative fields out there, blending surgery, science, clinical medicine. And it seemed that there were so many new things to try. I worried, would there even be enough patients to try all these things? And we unfortunately have lost some of that innovative edge, in part because the results are very, very good. And we became convinced the results were good enough. But that's because we looked at things that I think patients have taught us are important, but not the real measure. We looked at short-term things. How were you doing at a year? How many grafts were working at a year? And we focused on that and got very good, only to realize when we started, those were important metrics. But by now, that's a given. The likelihood of an organ not lasting a year is very short, barring unforeseen surgical complications. And so we need to shift to things that matter, I think, which is more like long-term graft function. As you say, how long will this last? And the other thing is the drugs we give create new diseases. And so sometimes you're trading one disease for another. And so we certainly have opportunities to try to design trials to develop things that address either the failure to prevent rejection, the harm that some drugs do to the transplanted organ, or the unwanted diseases that are induced, such as skin cancers or diabetes or cholesterol problems. To do this, though, we need to foster again or restart this pipeline of clinical agents that we can test. It's become so difficult for large companies to develop drugs because the way it's set up, the endpoints are all around short-term outcomes, and it's hard to show you do better. So you do a study with hundreds and hundreds of patients at great expense. The last drug approved was in clinical trials for 10 years before it was approved. And then the way the endpoints are, I have a drug that I can say, I think it might be better for you in terms of cancer risk or diabetes risk. But I can't say that because the study measures a short-term outcome. So all I can say is, this is equivalent to what's already out there. I can say that, and I can say, I hope it's better at other things, but I can't really tell you it is.
So that's a really interesting concept, though. And for the patients listening to the seminar who may not be as fluent, when it comes to clinical trial terminology, what you're talking about is a short-term endpoint that is, again, we talked about graft survival. So, how many patients who have had kidney transplant still have their kidneys within a year? That's over 90%, right? I mean, that's a very high.
Which is a good thing.
It's a very good thing. And it's a very good thing. No one is complaining about that. However, after 5 years, 10 years, that number declines. And during that time, we also see more patients develop diabetes, hypertension, skin cancer, other kinds of cancers, infections. The other diseases and the complications increase, but because it's over a longer period of time, the clinical trials aren't really structured to measure that.
And so I think what we need to do is partner with patients, with regulatory authorities, and come up with endpoints that matter to patients.
Yeah.
I think for years, transplant surgeons have tried to act in the best interest of patients, assuming that we knew what mattered. And I think the good thing that's happened in the last decade or more is that patients are now speaking for themselves, saying, these are the things that matter to me. And what I've heard is once you get beyond, can I get a transplant and what will the recovery look like? The real question is, how long does this last and what's my quality of life like during that time? And we don't really have any measures. So in order to develop new drugs that address the problems you talked about, we need some way of setting up a study to say, does a drug do better than what we currently have at getting you that outcome you want?
So how do you do that if you don't want to go out 10 years, which most companies, especially in the startup space, don't have the financing to do?
Yeah,
I've heard about something called surrogate endpoints or composite endpoints. What does that mean? And is that a way to pursue those kind of outcomes?
well, it is. And if you look in the field of cancer therapies, I think it's about half of the drugs approved currently are approved based on a measure that isn't a measure of how long you live with the treatment. So what you want with a cancer therapy would be, I want to live a long life. I'd like to be cured of the cancer. It's hard to do those types of studies. So in cancer, they've come up with other things like how much does the tumor shrink or things like that, where they can say, oh, we're seeing a really powerful effect that we believe leads, and not we believe, but we can demonstrate with reasonable likelihood that it will turn into that long, good outcome we want. And so that's called a surrogate endpoint. Mm-hmm. And cancer has many surrogate endpoints, as do other diseases. Transplant currently has really no surrogate endpoints. So it really limits us. And that's where I think we need to find out from patients what matters. We need to identify surrogate endpoints that predict those outcomes. And then we need to work with regulatory authorities to get them to endorse that. And, there's some tension here because if the surrogate endpoint turns out not to be a predictor, then you could, in theory, develop things that aren't very helpful. So we do have to consider the safety side. But I think currently we've become so entrenched in safety that it's going to be hard to come up with those next generation therapeutics.
So this is truly a collaboration between a public-private partnership working with the FDA, who hopefully is motivated to get new drugs and opportunities for patients out in the marketplace so that physicians and patients have a choice. Because a transplant may not be the same for every single person. It could be tailored to that individual, to different kinds of individuals, like we have choices in other disease areas. And there needs to be, of course, some sort of registry and looking at retrospective analysis to see what kind of indicators would lead to a detrimental effect. So is this a combination of prospective and retrospective? And what does that mean in clinical trials?
So typically what you could do is you could use so-called real-world data or data from large collections of transplants that have already happened. And you can mine that and say, of the people who got the outcome, what characteristics did they have? You could then put together a model that had one thing or many things that this group that did really well shared. You can then propose that as a endpoint or as a measure of success. And then you can go about doing that prospectively to prove, yes, we selected for these characteristics or traits, and it does correlate with a good outcome. And that would be the way that you would kind of come up with these surrogate endpoints, if you will.
And do you think that the transplant space, from a physician perspective, both the surgeons as well as the nephrologists, if we focus on kidney, are motivated to get better drugs out there? Or do the doctors as well think that it's good enough for the patients right now?
No, the late Dan Solomon was the past president of the American Society of Transplantation. He was the one that opened my eyes to this back maybe in like 2013. But he said, and I won't say it the way he did, but we have to get out the message that transplant is not good. We've gone on so long about how transformative it was and how great it was, and we were using 1 year outcome, and it was good. I mean, yourself, we were talking about it earlier. Transplant versus no transplant. Transplant's way better. And a number of people who, Amy Silverstein, a three-time heart recipient, spoke about the blessing of the transplant, but yet the curse. And Dan Solomon said something that caused me to look. And long-term outcomes of transplant are like having kind of medium-grade cancers when you just look at how it plays out. So it's way better than not getting the transplant, but it's way short of perfect. And I think physicians now, Dan was one of the first ones to really voice that to me. I think that is now widely appreciated by us. And in truth, you guys were always probably telling us that. But we were so enamored by the short-term results. Now we have to convince the broader society and the regulatory authorities that it's worth assuming a little risk, because with no risk, if you look at the evolution of surgery, when I trained, there was no laparoscopic surgery. There was risk to introducing that into practice, yet it's been transformative in medicine. So there has to be a way of measuring and mitigating risk. But if we say we want risk-free drug development, it will never happen.
Will never happen. That's exactly right. So I think that's at least some hope, and I think it's up to the patients to speak up and partner with the FDA and the scientists and industry. When it comes to the supply of transplanted organs, right now we're relying on allo transplants who are in dialysis chairs. Now we're getting on the list. And as we said before, life with a transplant even is so much better than life on dialysis. From any kind of measure, it is worth the risk. We, of course, need to do it in a regulated fashion. And I also want to thank ITB Med for sponsoring this seminar series. And I welcome, of course, anyone who wants to contact us afterwards to reach out. Thank you very much.